August 4th, 1933. Charlie Shep rows across the Salmon River and finds his neighbor collapsed beside her cabin. She's 80 years old. She has been living alone in this canyon for 9 years. The walls rise 7,000 feet on either side, deeper than the Grand Canyon. No roads reach this place, no telephone lines. The nearest doctor is 17 miles away by horseback through switchbacks carved into cliffs. They strap her to a horse and begin the evacuation. Behind her, the cabin stands solid. 15 by 20 feet of whipsaw lumber on stone foundation. It has endured 39 Idaho winters. It will endure 90 more. This is how a 4'5" Chinese woman built something that outlasted everything. Shep finds Polly Bemis collapsed on the ground beside her cabin. She is 80 years old. She has been living alone in this wilderness for 9 years. Her speech comes out garbled, a stroke most likely. She cannot stand. They strap her to a horse. The trail to Grangeville is brutal. Switchbacks carved into cliffs, creek crossings swollen with summer melt. For anyone else, this evacuation would be the story. For Polly Bemis, it is merely the end of a much longer journey. As they carry her away, her cabin stands solid behind her. 15 by 20 feet of whipsaw lumber on a stone foundation. It has endured 39 Idaho winters. It will endure 90 more. In 1988, it will be placed on the National Register of Historic Places. Polly Bemis arrived in this canyon in 1894 as a 40-year-old Chinese immigrant who had been sold twice, first by her father for 2 bags of seed, then by slave traders for $2,500. The law said she did not belong in America. The wilderness said no one belonged in this canyon at all. She stayed anyway, for 39 years. For the last 9, completely alone. This is how she did it. Northern China, 1871. The drought had killed the crops for the second year. Bandits had taken what little remained. Polly's father gathered his children and counted them the way a man counts coins when the debt collector is at the door. He had a choice: lose them all to starvation, or sell one to save the rest. Polly was 18 years old. Her feet had been bound since childhood, the traditional practice meant to secure a good marriage, now a marker that made her valuable to traders. Her father sold her for 2 bags of seed, enough to plant 1 more crop, enough to keep her siblings alive through another winter. The bandits who bought her did not keep her long. They sold her to slave traders in Shanghai. The traders packed her onto a ship bound for San Francisco. The crossing took weeks. When the ship docked, Polly was led to an auction house where men bid on Chinese girls who could not understand a word being spoken about them. $2,500. That was her price. A merchant paid it and arranged transport north. An elderly Chinese woman smuggled Polly up the Columbia River to Portland. From Portland, a pack train carried her across the Idaho wilderness. 9 days through mountains she had never seen, toward a place she could not imagine. July 8th, 1872. Polly arrived in Warren, Idaho. Warren sat at 5,906 feet elevation, a gold mining camp carved into the mountains. In December alone, the town received over 20 inches of snow. Temperatures dropped to 48 degrees below zero. Winters lasted 6 months. When the passes closed, the camp was cut off from the outside world entirely. By 1879, the population was 800 Chinese and 200 whites, almost no women of any race. Polly was delivered to a Chinese businessman who ran a saloon. She was 4 feet 5 inches tall, 53 inches. She spoke no English. She could not even communicate with most of the Chinese miners. Her northern dialect was incomprehensible to the Cantonese speakers who dominated the camps. She was property, in a place where property had no voice and no protection. The law made certain of that. In 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. No more Chinese immigrants allowed. 10 years later, the Geary Act went further. Every Chinese resident in America was required to carry a certificate of residence. Those without papers faced deportation and hard labor. Polly had been smuggled in. She had no papers, no documentation, no legal right to exist on American soil. The immigration inspector who came through Warren in 1896 made the law's position clear. He gathered Polly and 22 Chinese men and told them they would face a court in Moscow, Idaho. The charge: failure to register. The penalty: removal from the country, back to a China that had sold her, back to a family that had traded her for seed. The brutal math was simple: a 53-inch woman, no legal status, no language, no family, no property. Winters that killed miners with far more resources. A legal system designed to erase her from American soil. Conventional survival was impossible. She would have to find another way. In a saloon full of drunk miners, Polly learned to read men the way other people read weather. She noticed who reached for a knife when the whiskey hit, who cheated at cards, who looked at her like merchandise, and who looked at her like a person. Charlie Bemis was not dangerous. He was a Connecticut jeweler's son who had come west chasing gold and discovered he was better at cards and fiddle playing than mining. He owned the saloon next door. He was fearless with a pistol, but never looking for trouble. When things turned ugly in her owner's establishment, when a miner's hands went where they should not go, when voices rose and bottles broke, Polly would slip out the back door and through Charlie's place. He never failed her. He never asked for anything in return. The miners in Warren watched this. A Chinese woman, a white man's saloon. The gossip spread the way gossip does in small places with long winters. Some said Charlie had won her in a poker game. Others assumed she was working as a prostitute. The stories were easier than the truth, that a woman with no power was building power, one small alliance at a time. Polly denied the poker story until her dying breath. She was no one's prize. She had earned her place. She made herself indispensable. She learned English, halting at first, then functional. She learned to cook American food. She took in laundry. She studied the customs and manners that would let her move through this brutal world without being crushed by it. Then came September of 1890. A gambler shot Charlie Bemis in the face during a card dispute. The bullet shattered his cheekbone, narrowly missing his eye, blood everywhere. Charlie collapsed. Someone rode to Grangeville for a doctor, a hard journey that took precious hours. The doctor arrived, examined the wound, and delivered his verdict. The damage was too severe. Infection would set in. Charlie Bemis would die. Polly refused to accept this. She had no medical training, no credentials, no authority. What she had was a crochet hook, knowledge passed down through generations of Chinese women, and the will to try when the white doctor had given up. She used the crochet hook to clean the wound, extracting bone fragments and debris. She packed the wound with herbs, remedies the doctor would have dismissed as superstition. She made nutritious soups and broths. She changed the dressings. She watched for fever. Week after week, Charlie did not die. The wound healed. The infection never came. Charlie Bemis survived. The community saw it. The woman who stood 4 feet 5 inches tall, who spoke broken English, who had no formal training of any kind, she had saved a life that educated medicine had abandoned. Peter Klinkhammer, who would later become Polly's neighbor and closest friend, observed their relationship with the practical eye of a man who understood survival. The marriage that came 4 years later, he said, was a marriage of convenience on the part of both. Charlie needed someone to care for him. His face was ruined. His card-playing days were numbered. He needed a partner. Polly needed legal status. The Geary Act was coming. The courts were calling. Without protection, she would be deported to a country that had already sold her once. August 13th, 1894. Polly and Charlie Bemis married in an Idaho County courthouse. It was not a love story. It was a survival strategy. The immigration case went forward anyway. Polly stood before judges in Moscow, Idaho, then again in Helena, Montana. 22 Chinese men stood with her. All of them faced the same charge: residing in America without proper documentation. August 10th, 1896. The court issued its ruling. Polly Bemis received her certificate of residence. The system designed to remove her had been forced to recognize her. The woman who arrived in America as property now had papers declaring her right to stay. But staying in Warren meant staying under the eyes of people who would always see her as less than. The gossips. The men who still looked at her like merchandise. The legal system that could change its mind at any moment. Charlie had another idea. In 1893, while Polly fought for her right to exist, Charlie Bemis bought a mining claim 17 miles north of Warren, not on any road, not near any town, on the banks of the Salmon River, in a canyon so deep and so remote that even Lewis and Clark had turned back. The River of No Return. That was what they called it. The Salmon River flows 425 miles through central Idaho. For 180 of those miles, the canyon drops more than a mile deep. In 1805, the Lewis and Clark expedition attempted to navigate it. The rapids proved too fierce, the canyon walls too sheer. They abandoned the attempt and found another route. Miners who came later learned to build wooden boats upstream. They loaded the boats with supplies and floated down through the rapids. At the journey's end, they dismantled the boats for lumber. There was no going back upriver, hence the name. The canyon walls rose 7,000 feet. Winter temperatures plummeted below zero. The nearest help was hours away by boat, or a 17-mile trail that became impassable when snow fell. When winter came, anyone living in that canyon was alone until spring. Why would anyone choose this? Because in the canyon, the Chinese Exclusion Act could not reach you. In the canyon, the gossips of Warren could not whisper. In the canyon, there were no immigration inspectors, no courts, no men who looked at a Chinese woman and saw only what she had been. In the canyon, Polly Bemis could live on her own terms. She and Charlie filed their claim and built their first cabin just yards from the riverside, at the mouth of Crooked Creek. The location was strategic, close enough to water for irrigation, high enough to survive the spring floods, positioned where the canyon widened just enough to catch sunlight for a garden. The ranch took shape. Polly planted vegetables using techniques from her childhood in northern China: cabbage, beans, corn, potatoes. She planted fruit trees: apples, cherries, peaches, gooseberries. She raised chickens, cows, horses, a dog, a cat, and, according to neighbors, a mountain lion that Charlie caught as a cub. The cougar ate from a tin plate nailed to the table, tame as any house cat. For years, Polly rarely left the ranch. Charlie would travel to Warren to sell their produce and check on his saloon. Polly stayed behind. She fished the river, once catching 27 fish in a single day. She preserved vegetables and fruit for the winters. She learned the rhythms of a place that should not have supported human life. The canyon tested her constantly. Flash floods that came without warning, rock slides that blocked trails for weeks, temperatures that dropped so fast a person could freeze between the cabin and the woodpile. Every year, the wilderness asked the same question: do you belong here? Every year, Polly answered, but she had not yet faced the real test. The canyon had accepted her presence. It had not yet demanded proof of her right to stay. That proof would require something she did not yet have: witnesses. In the winter of 1909, two men homesteaded on Crooked Creek. Charlie Shep was born in Iowa in 1861, a rancher and miner who had worked claims across the West. Peter Klinkhammer was born in Minnesota in 1881, 20 years younger than Shep, 45 years younger than Polly. They built their cabin directly across the river from the Bemis place, close enough to see smoke from the chimney, far enough that the river stood between them. The canyon had been Polly's alone for 15 years. Now she had neighbors. Shep and Klinkhammer were not like the men in Warren. They did not look at Polly and see a Chinese woman who did not belong. They saw a neighbor, someone who had survived in this impossible place longer than anyone. They watched her work the garden that first spring, watched her coax yields from rocky soil that should have grown nothing, watched her preserve food with techniques none of them had seen before. They became friends. The communication system they developed was simple. When Polly needed help, she hung a white dish towel on a bush by the river. Shep or Klinkhammer would see it from across the water and row over. Later, they strung a telephone wire across the river, a fragile line in a place without any other infrastructure, but enough to hear a voice when a voice was needed. Polly fed them. Everyone who came to the Bemis Ranch was fed. Miners floating down the river stopped at Polly Place knowing they could trade fresh game for vegetables from the garden. Prospectors, early tourists seeking adventure, journalists who had heard stories about the Chinese woman living in the River of No Return. Countess Eleanor Gazika visited in the early 1920s and wrote about Polly for Field and Stream magazine. She described the garden, the hospitality, the woman who had made a home where no home should exist. Polly's reputation grew. The pioneer of the Salmon River, the woman who belonged to the canyon. But belonging was not the same as staying. Charlie Bemis was getting weaker. By 1919, Charlie could not leave his bed. Lung ailment, probably tuberculosis. The lazy fiddler who had once protected Polly in the saloons of Warren now lay upstairs in their cabin, coughing blood into handkerchiefs she washed and dried and folded for use again. Polly was 66 years old. She ran the ranch alone. Every morning she rose before dawn, fed the animals, checked the garden, hauled water, split wood, climbed the stairs to bring Charlie his breakfast, climbed down to work, climbed up to bring lunch, climbed down to work, climbed up to bring dinner, climbed down to bank the fire for the night. At 3 o'clock each afternoon, Klinkhammer said you could set your clock by it. She walked to the river with worms from the garden in the big pocket of her dress. She fished until she had enough for supper. Then she cleaned the fish, cooked the meal, carried Charlie's portion upstairs, and ate her own meal alone. The dish towel went up more often now. Shep and Klinkhammer rowed across to help with tasks too heavy for one person. They asked if she needed them to stay. She sent them home, 67. The garden still produced. Charlie still coughed. 68. The fruit trees she had planted were bearing now, apples that would still be growing a century later. Charlie could no longer sit up without help. The woman who had been sold as property was now the sole provider and caretaker for the man who had given her shelter. The roles had reversed completely. The debt had been repaid many times over, but Polly did not keep accounts. She kept Charlie alive. For 3 years she maintained this rhythm, work in the land, nursing her husband, surviving winters that would have broken people half her age. The canyon watched. The canyon waited. Then came the summer of 1922. Polly was 68 years old, 28 summers in the canyon. The garden was producing its best yields ever. The orchard was heavy with fruit. Everything she had built was thriving. Charlie had not left the upstairs bedroom in months. The afternoon was hot. Polly was outside, perhaps at the river fishing, perhaps in the garden. The exact location would never be recorded. What was recorded was the smoke. It curled from the upstairs window first, then thickened, then billowed. The wood stove had overheated, or been left unattended, or simply failed in the way that old stoves in old cabins sometimes fail. It did not matter. The cabin was burning. Charlie was inside, bedridden. Polly ran. She shouted across the river. Shep saw the smoke, grabbed his boat, rowed with everything he had. By the time they reached Charlie, the cabin was fully engulfed. Polly and Shep dragged the invalid out through smoke so thick they could barely see. They pulled him across the ground, away from the flames, and turned back to watch 28 years of work burn to nothing. The cabin, the furniture, the photographs, the wedding dress from 1894. Everything they had built. Gone. Charlie survived. Barely. They moved across the river to live with Shep and Klinkhammer. 2 invalids now, Charlie from his illness, Polly from shock, crowded into a bachelor miner's cabin built for one. The fire had weakened Charlie beyond recovery. The smoke, the trauma, the final blow to a body that had been failing for years. October 29th, 1922. Charlie Bemis died. He was 74 years old. They had been married 28 years. Polly stood at the grave they dug on the far side of the river. 69 years old, widow, no home, no income. Living on the charity of neighbors in a canyon accessible only by boat. The woman who had been sold for 2 bags of seed had lost everything. Again. Shep and Klinkhammer made their offer over dinner that winter. They would rebuild the cabin on the original site. Same dimensions, 15 by 20 feet, single pen log construction on a stone foundation, whipsaw lumber walls, gable front with overhanging roof. In exchange, they would inherit the property after her death. It was a practical arrangement. They were younger. They would outlive her. The property would pass to them eventually anyway. This way, Polly would have a home for whatever years remained. The question hung in the cabin's smoky air. Why stay? Polly could move to Warren permanently. She had friends there, people who would take her in, let her live out her days in relative comfort. She could go to Boise. She had visited once during a previous trip, seen her first moving picture, ridden her first streetcar. Cities had doctors, hospitals, heat that did not require cutting and hauling wood. She was 69 years old. She had earned rest. The canyon offered no rest. Only more winters, only more isolation, only the certainty that age would eventually win. Polly accepted the offer. The canyon was hers. She had earned it. 30 years of work, 30 years of survival, 30 years of proving that a 53-inch woman sold for seed could outlast everything designed to destroy her. She was not leaving. Construction began in the spring of 1923. Shep and Klinkhammer felled trees and squared the logs. They operated a whipsaw, one man above, one man below, pulling the long blade through timber to create boards. They laid a stone foundation. They raised walls. They built a splined floor and a sleeping loft. During the construction, Polly stayed in Warren. She was not idle. She took in a 6-year-old girl named Gay Carey who needed a board in town for school. Even homeless, even widowed, Polly was still caring for others. 1924. The cabin was finished. Charlie Shep gave Polly a gift for her new home, a radio. After 52 years in the wilderness, after a life that began before electricity existed, Polly Bemis could listen to voices from the outside world. She moved back into the canyon. Her neighbors would check on her. They would help plant her garden each spring. They would watch for the white dish towel on the bush. But day to day, hour to hour, she would be alone. Polly Bemis was 70 years old. The real test was just beginning. The first winter alone, Polly discovered what silence truly meant. In Warren, there had always been noise, miners arguing, horses, the clatter of the saloon. Even in the canyon with Charlie, there had been his coughing, his fiddle on good days, his voice calling down from the upstairs bedroom. Now there was only the river, the wind through the canyon, the creak of the cabin settling against the cold. She was 70 years old. The garden was dormant under snow. The preserves she had put up lined the shelves, jars of vegetables, dried fruit, smoked fish, enough to last until spring if she was careful, if nothing went wrong. The routine saved her. Every morning before dawn, she rose and built up the fire, fed the remaining animals, checked the food stores, listened to the radio Shep had given her, voices from a world that seemed impossibly far away. News of cities, music, plays, evidence that somewhere beyond these 7,000-foot walls, life continued. At 3 o'clock, if the weather allowed, she walked to the river. The fishing was harder now. Her hands ached in the cold. Some days she caught nothing. Some days she caught enough for 3 meals. She crocheted. She sewed. She mended clothes that had been mended so many times the original fabric was barely visible. She talked to herself, first in English, then in the northern Chinese dialect no one in America understood. The sound of her own voice was company. Across the river, Shep and Klinkhammer watched for smoke from her chimney. If a day passed without smoke, they would row over. They checked on her regularly, every few days in good weather, more often when storms threatened. But they could not be there every moment. They could not sit with her through the long nights when the temperature dropped below zero and the fire had to be fed every few hours or the cabin would become a tomb. The first winter passed. Spring came. Shep and Klinkhammer rowed across to help plant the garden. Polly directed them. This row for beans, this row for potatoes. The fruit trees need pruning here and here. They followed her instructions. She had forgotten more about coaxing food from this soil than they would ever learn. The garden produced. The summer was good. The preserving began again. The second winter came. Polly was 71. The routine held. Rise before dawn. Build the fire. Check the stores. Listen to the radio. Fish if possible. Crochet. Sew. Talk to herself. Feed the fire through the night. The cold that winter was brutal. Temperatures dropped so low that ice formed on the inside of the windows. Polly wore every piece of clothing she owned to bed. She woke twice each night to add wood to the stove. One morning she could not get out of bed. Her joints had locked. The cold had seeped into her bones and refused to leave. She lay there as the fire burned down, as the cabin temperature dropped, as the morning light crept across the floor. She thought about the dish towel. If she could get to the door, hang it on the bush, Shep would see it. He would come. But the door was across the room, and her legs would not move. She waited. The fire burned lower. The cold crept closer. Then she moved. One leg over the side of the bed, then the other, hands gripping the frame, standing, shuffling, each step a negotiation with a body that wanted to surrender. She reached the stove, added wood, stood there until the heat loosened her joints enough to move normally. She did not hang the dish towel. The second winter passed. The years began to blur. 72, 73, 74. Each winter a test, each spring a reprieve, each summer a preparation for the winter to come. Polly's world shrank to the dimensions of survival. The garden, the river, the cabin, the preserves on the shelf, the wood stacked against the wall, the fire that must never go out. She stopped counting the days. The seasons told her everything she needed to know. When the snow melted, plant. When the fruit ripened, preserve. When the leaves fell, prepare. When the snow came, endure. Visitors still came in summer. Miners floating down the river stopped at Polly Place, knowing they could trade game for fresh vegetables. She fed them all. She asked for news of the outside world. She listened to their stories and told a few of her own. Some of them wrote about her later, the tiny Chinese woman living alone in the deepest canyon in America. The pioneer who had outlasted everyone. She did not think of herself as a pioneer. She thought of herself as someone who had nowhere else to go. 75. The Great Depression was destroying the country. Banks failed. Bread lines formed in cities. Men who had owned homes now slept in shelters. In the Salmon River Canyon, nothing changed. Polly grew her food, caught her fish, burned her wood. The economic collapse that devastated millions could not reach a woman who had never depended on the economy in the first place. 76, 77. The winters grew harder to bear. Her hands cramped when she tried to crochet. Her eyesight dimmed. The walk to the river took longer each year, but the routine held. Rise before dawn, build the fire, check the stores, listen to the radio, fish if possible, endure. 78, 79. 9 winters alone now. 9 years of proving that survival was possible in a place that rejected human habitation. The fruit trees she had planted were mature now. The orchard produced abundantly: apples, cherries, peaches. In the spring of 1933, the Lost Apple Project would not exist for another 90 years, but the trees that would give that project a variety to name after Polly Bemis were already bearing fruit. Summer came. The garden flourished. At 3 o'clock each afternoon, Polly walked to the river with worms in her pocket. She was 80 years old. She had been alone for 9 years. She did not know that summer would be her last in the canyon. August 4th, 1933. The morning began like every other morning. Polly rose before dawn, built up the fire, checked the garden. The tomatoes were ripening. The beans needed picking. Another day of work in a lifetime of days. Sometime after noon, the exact hour was never recorded. Something changed inside her body. A vessel in her brain, weakened by 80 years of living, gave way. Blood pooled where blood should not pool. Neural pathways that had carried her thoughts and commands and memories for 8 decades went dark. She was in the garden, or near the cabin, or walking toward the river. The accounts differ because no one was there to see. What is certain? Polly Bemis fell. She lay on the ground beside the cabin she had fought so hard to rebuild. The sun moved across the sky. The garden waited for hands that could not reach it. The river flowed past, indifferent. Across the water, Charlie Shep finished his morning work and looked toward the Bemis place. He had been checking on Polly for 9 years. He knew her routines better than his own. By this hour, she should have been visible in the garden by the river, moving between the cabin and the outbuildings. He saw nothing. He waited, Perhaps she was inside. Perhaps she was resting. She was 80 years old. She was entitled to rest. An hour passed. No movement. Shep got in his boat. He rowed across the river with the efficiency of a man who had made this crossing hundreds of times, pulled the boat onto the bank, walked toward the cabin. He found her on the ground. Her eyes were open but unfocused. Her speech came out garbled, sounds that might have been words in English or Chinese, or some language that existed only in a brain that was shutting down. She could not stand. She could not tell him what had happened. Shep did not need her to tell him. He had seen strokes before. He knew what this was. He also knew what this meant. The nearest doctor was in Grangeville. Grangeville was 17 miles away by trail, a trail that climbed out of the canyon through switchbacks carved into cliffs, across creek crossings swollen with summer melt, through wilderness that would challenge a healthy person on a good day. Polly Bemis could not walk. She could barely speak, and she needed a doctor now. Shep got Klinkhammer. Together, they lifted Polly and carried her to where the horses were kept. They fashioned a litter. They strapped her to a horse. The evacuation began. 17 miles, switchbacks that dropped away to nothing on one side, rock faces that radiated the August heat, creek crossings where a stumble could send horse and rider into water that ran fast and cold even in summer. Polly drifted in and out of consciousness. She had made this trip before, down to the canyon when she was 40 years old, up from the canyon on rare visits to Warren, but never like this, never strapped to a horse, never unable to control her own body. The hours crawled past. Behind her, growing smaller with each switchback, the canyon that had been her home for 39 years fell away. The cabin stood solid on its stone foundation. The garden ripened in the August sun. The fruit trees bent under the weight of their harvest. She would not see any of it again. Grangeville, Idaho Valley Hospital. A bed with clean sheets. Doctors who spoke in low voices and shook their heads. The diagnosis was what Shep had known the moment he found her. Stroke. Massive. At 80 years old, with no access to modern medicine for 9 years, the prognosis was grim. But Polly Bemis had been defying prognoses her entire life. She survived the first night, then the first week, then the first month. As her condition stabilized, something unexpected happened. She began to talk. Not the garbled sounds of the first days. Words, sentences, stories. The nurses gathered around her bed. Visitors came, people who had heard about the Chinese woman from the river of no return. Journalists arrived with notebooks, and Polly talked. She talked about her childhood in China, about the drought and the bandits and the father who sold her for seed, about the ship to San Francisco and the auction where men bid on girls who could not understand the words being spoken. She talked about Warren, about the saloons and the miners and the Chinese businessman who had owned her, about Charlie Bemis and the gunshot and the crochet hook she used to save his life. She talked about the canyon, about the garden and the fruit trees and the fish she caught at 3 o'clock every afternoon, about the fire that destroyed everything and the neighbors who helped her rebuild. She talked about the 9 winters alone, about the silence and the cold and the routine that kept her alive when nothing else could. For 3 months, Polly Bemis told her story to anyone who would listen, as if she knew this was her last chance, as if she needed the world to understand what she had done and why. November 5th, 1933. A lengthy newspaper article was published, documenting her life in detail drawn from these conversations. November 6th, 1933. Polly Bemis died. The cause was listed as myocarditis, inflammation of the heart. She was 80 years old. She had lived in the Salmon River Canyon for 39 years. She had outlived her husband by 11 years. She had survived 9 winters completely alone. She had proven that a 4'5" woman sold for 2 bags of seed could outlast everything the law and the wilderness and time itself could throw at her. Polly had one final wish. She wanted to be buried in the canyon. But November in Idaho is no time for a 17-mile journey into the wilderness. The trails were already treacherous. Snow was coming. The practical men who had been her neighbors for 24 years made the practical decision. They buried her in Grangeville. The grave was marked. The services were held. The newspaper articles ran their course. The world moved on. In the canyon, the cabin stood empty. The garden went fallow. The fruit trees dropped their harvest onto ground where no one walked. For 54 years, Polly Bemis lay in Grangeville, while her heart remained 17 miles away. Then, in 1987, something changed. The state of Idaho decided to restore the Polly Bemis cabin. The structure had survived 65 winters since her death. The whipsaw lumber, the stone foundation, the gable roof that Shep and Klinkhammer had built with such care. It was deteriorating but still standing. Governor Cecil Andrus traveled to the site for the dedication ceremony. He stood on the banks of the Salmon River, looked up at the canyon walls rising a mile into the sky, and considered what had happened here. His words were recorded. The history of Polly Bemis is a great part of the legacy of central Idaho. She is the foremost pioneer on the rugged Salmon River. The foremost pioneer. Not a footnote, not an exception. The foremost. A woman who arrived in America as property, who was told by law that she did not belong, who was told by the wilderness that no one could survive here. The foremost pioneer. The same year, they exhumed her remains from Grangeville. They brought her back to the canyon by boat, down the river that had defined her life, through rapids that had not changed in 100 years. They buried her beside her cabin, across the river from Charlie, exactly where she had always wanted to be. March 4th, 1988. The Polly Bemis Ranch was placed on the National Register of Historic Places. The documentation recorded everything. The cabin dimensions, 15 by 20 feet. The construction method, single pen log with whipsaw lumber. The stone foundation. The splined floor. The gable roof. It also recorded what the cabin represented. A woman who had been sold as a child, who had survived slavery and exclusion and widowhood and fire, who had lived alone in the most isolated canyon in the continental United States for 9 years. The cabin was not just architecture, it was proof. The system that had tried to deport her was long gone. The Chinese Exclusion Act was repealed in 1943. The Geary Act died with it. The legal apparatus that had been designed to remove Polly Bemis from American soil was now a footnote in history books. Her cabin was a museum. In 1991, a film called Thousand Pieces of Gold dramatized her life. The story was fictionalized. Hollywood could not resist adding romance and drama where the real story was quieter and stronger. But it brought her name to audiences who had never heard of the River of No Return. In 1996, Polly Bemis was inducted into the Idaho Hall of Fame. A woman who had arrived in the state as property, who had never voted, never held office, never accumulated wealth or power as the world measures such things. Hall of Fame. August 10th, 2021. Governor Brad Little signed a proclamation. Henceforth, August 10th, the anniversary of the day she won her certificate of residence in 1896, would be known as Polly Bemis Day in Idaho. A life-size bronze statue was unveiled at the state capitol, 4 feet 5 inches tall, the same height she had stood when she arrived in Warren as a teenage girl who did not speak the language. The statue stands there now, permanent, undeniable. And in 2023, something small and wonderful happened. The Lost Apple Project, an organization dedicated to rediscovering heritage apple varieties, was working in central Idaho. They found their way to the Polly Bemis Ranch. The orchard she had planted was still there. The trees she had tended were still bearing fruit. 130 years after she first put seedlings in the ground, apples were still ripening in the summer sun. The Lost Apple Project tested the fruit. They confirmed it was a variety that existed nowhere else in their records. They named it the Polly Bemis apple. Her garden is still producing, a century after her hands last touched the soil. The Polly Bemis Ranch sits on 27 acres surrounded by the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness Area, 2.2 million acres of protected land, the largest wilderness area in the continental United States. There are still no roads. Visitors arrive by jet boat, launched from Riggins and piloted through Whitewater Rapids. The journey takes roughly 30 minutes. The canyon walls rise on either side, 7,000 feet of vertical relief, deeper than the Grand Canyon. The river runs fast and cold. The boat pulls up to the same bank where Polly fished every afternoon at 3 o'clock. The cabin looks much as it did when she lived there. The stone foundation Shep and Klinkhammer laid in 1923, the whipsaw lumber walls, the gable roof that has shed over 100 winters of Idaho snow. Inside, artifacts and photographs connect visitors to her life. The image of her in her wedding dress, the photograph she gave to young gay Carrie, the girl who boarded with her during the cabin's construction, tools she used to work the garden, evidence of a woman who built something permanent in a place that resists permanence. Visitors walk the same ground she walked. They look up at the same canyon walls. They listen to the same river. Most of them stay for an hour, maybe 2. They take photographs. They read the plaques. They try to imagine what it must have been like. Then they get back in the boat and return to a world of roads and electricity and hospitals and grocery stores. Polly Bemis lived here for 39 years, for the last 9, alone. Stand at the cabin door. Look up at canyon walls rising a mile into the sky. Listen to the river, 425 miles of water that Lewis and Clark declared unnavigable, that miners called the River of No Return because the only way through was down and the only way out was gone. A 4'5" Chinese woman made her home here. She arrived in America as property, sold by her father for 2 bags of seed, sold again in San Francisco for $2,500, delivered to a mining camp at the edge of the known world, where she had no language, no rights, no future she could control. The law said she did not belong. The Chinese Exclusion Act, the Geary Act, papers demanded, deportation threatened, the entire legal machinery of the United States designed to erase her. The wilderness said no one belonged. 7,000 feet of vertical stone, winters that killed men with more resources. Isolation so complete that a cry for help would reach no one. She stayed anyway, for 39 years. For the last 9, completely alone. She built a garden that still produces fruit. She saved a man's life with a crochet hook and knowledge that educated doctors dismissed. She fought the courts and won. She lost everything to fire and rebuilt. She nursed a dying husband and buried him and chose to stay in the place that had demanded so much from her. When they found her on the ground in August of 1933, the cabin stood solid behind her. When they carried her out of the canyon for the last time, the cabin remained. It is still there. The Geary Act is gone. The Chinese Exclusion Act is gone. The immigration inspectors who came to Warren to remove her are dust and footnotes. Polly Bemis is in the Idaho Hall of Fame. Her statue stands at the state capitol. Her apple grows in an orchard she planted 130 years ago. Some things are built to last. Some people, too.